It's dawn, 50,000 years ago. A small child, maybe 5 years old, opens her eyes inside a shelter made from animal hides stretched over wooden poles. The air is cold enough to see her breath. Outside, frost covers the grassland in silver. Her mother is already awake, rekindling yesterday's fire with practiced efficiency. Her father is checking stone tools, preparing for the day's hunt. Within minutes, this little girl will leave the shelter and begin her education. Not in a classroom, not with a teacher holding a lesson plan, not with books or worksheets or grades. And yet, by the time she reaches 12 years old, she'll know more practical survival skills than most adults alive today. She'll be able to identify over 300 plants and know which ones heal, which ones kill, and which ones keep you alive when everything else fails. She'll track animals across terrain that looks identical to untrained eyes, reading stories in disturbed leaves and bent grass. She'll start fire from nothing. She'll craft tools that can cut, scrape, pierce, and sew. She'll know which clouds mean rain is coming, which animal calls mean danger, and which direction leads back to camp even when landmarks disappear. How? How did children growing up 50,000 years ago learn everything they needed to survive in one of the harshest environments humans have ever faced? Without schools, without formal teachers, without a single written word to guide them? That's the question that should keep you up at night, because the answer reveals an educational system so effective that it kept our species alive for hundreds of thousands of years, and it looked nothing like what we call education today. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's literally why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check comments and it's like Tokyo at lunch, Toronto at midnight, all at once. The algorithm loves it when you comment, and honestly, I just think it's cool. Now here's what makes Ice Age childhood so mind-bending. These kids didn't have it easier than modern children, not even close. By age 7, most had witnessed death, maybe of siblings, definitely of people in their band. By age 10, they were contributing real labour to their group's survival. By 15, many were parents themselves. But here's the paradox. In many ways, they were also freer than children today. They weren't sitting still for 6 hours a day. They weren't being tested and graded and compared. They weren't learning abstract concepts they wouldn't use for years, if ever. Everything they learned because they needed it. Right now, to survive. Today, we're focusing on a specific window in human history. Roughly 50,000 to 30,000 years ago, right in the middle of the last ice age. This was after humans had developed language, art, and complex tools, but thousands of years before agriculture, before cities, before anything resembling civilization as we know it. Anatomically modern humans, people who looked exactly like us, living in small bands of 20 to 150 individuals, moving across landscapes that range from frozen tundra to dense forests. These were your direct ancestors. Their DNA flows through your veins right now. And every single one of them went through a childhood that would be unrecognizable to anyone alive today. Think about it this way. Take an average 6-year-old from a modern city and drop them in the Ice Age. They'd be dead within a week, maybe days. They wouldn't know what to eat. They wouldn't know how to find water. They'd have no idea which animals to run from and which to ignore. They couldn't make fire. They couldn't make tools. They couldn't navigate. They couldn't communicate their needs effectively to people whose language they don't speak. Now flip it. Take an average 6-year-old from 50,000 years ago and bring them to modern times. Give them a few months to learn the language and basic social norms. They'd adapt. Not easily, but they could do it. Because Ice Age children weren't learning narrow specialized skills. They were learning how to learn, how to observe, how to remember, how to problem solve when the problem is life or death. The question isn't just, what did Ice Age children learn? It's how did they learn it? What was the system? Because there was a system. It just operated on principles completely alien to modern education. There were no grades, but there was constant assessment. Life itself was the test, and failing meant death. There were no formal teachers, but everyone was teaching all the time. There were no classrooms, but the entire landscape was a school, and every moment was a lesson. What we're about to explore isn't ancient history. It's the educational blueprint that shaped human brains for hundreds of thousands of years. Everything about how you think, how you learn, how you understand the world was forged during childhoods that looked like this. So when we ask how Ice Age kids actually grew up, we're really asking something deeper. How did humans become human? And what have we lost in the 10,000 years since we decided there was a better way? Picture a birth 50,000 years ago, not in a hospital, not even in a permanent dwelling. Your mother goes into labour while her band is camped near a seasonal water source, maybe a spring that only flows during the wet months. The group has been here for 3 weeks, long enough to build temporary shelters from branches and animal hides, but everyone knows they'll move on soon. When game moves, you move. When water dries up, you move. When resources get depleted, you move. There's no staying put, not for something as routine as childbirth. But here's the thing. Birth wasn't something women faced alone. As soon as the contraction started, the experienced women in the band would have gathered. Not because of some beautiful, ancient wisdom about sisterhood, but because childbirth was dangerous, and having help meant the difference between life and death. These weren't trained midwives. They were women who had given birth themselves, who had watched other births, who had learned through observation and experience what worked and what didn't. They would have prepared a space in one of the shelters, probably away from the main camp area, but close enough that help was available if needed. Soft hides for padding, fire for warmth and light, water for drinking, plant materials that generations of women had learned could ease pain or stop bleeding. This knowledge didn't come from books or formal training. It came from watching, from trying things, from remembering what worked when things went right, and what was happening when things went terribly wrong. The birth itself would have been assisted but not managed. No doctors, no interventions, just gravity and time and the support of women who understood the process because they'd survived it themselves. If complications arose, the band's collective knowledge would be deployed, specific positions that could help, pressure points that sometimes eased pain, plant preparations that might slow bleeding or speed contractions, and sometimes, often enough to make it a constant fear, none of it worked. Maternal mortality was high. Infant mortality was even higher. The archaeological record shows this clearly. Skeletal remains of young women with indicators of death during childbirth. Tiny bones that never made it past infancy. This wasn't a gentle, natural paradise. This was survival at its most brutal, and every successful birth represented a small victory against enormous odds. But let's say the birth goes well. Your mother survives. You survive. You take your first breath in a shelter made of sticks and skins, surrounded by women who will help raise you, watched over by a band of 20 to 30 people who now have a vested interest in your survival. What happens next is nothing like modern infancy. First, there's the breastfeeding. Not for 6 months or a year like modern recommendations, for 3 to 5 years, sometimes longer. This wasn't a parenting choice, it was biological necessity. Mother's milk was the only reliably safe food for infants and toddlers. No bottles, no formula, no carefully prepared baby food, just milk, and lots of it, for years. This extended breastfeeding did something else crucial. It naturally spaced births. Women who are breastfeeding intensively often don't ovulate, a phenomenon called lactational amenorrhea. This meant births were typically spaced 3 to 4 years apart, which was essential because there's no way a woman in a mobile hunting and gathering band could manage carrying 2 infants simultaneously across the landscape. But breastfeeding was just the beginning of the physical contact. From the moment you were born, you were essentially never alone. Your mother carried you, constantly. Not in a high-tech baby carrier with lumbar support and ergonomic design. In a sling fashioned from animal hide or woven plant fibers, tied across her body so you rested against her chest or hip or back depending on what she was doing. This wasn't about attachment parenting philosophy. This was pure practicality. The band was mobile. When they moved, and they moved constantly, everyone had to carry their possessions. Women couldn't leave infants behind while they gathered food or processed hides or collected firewood. So babies came along for everything, carried in constant skin-to-skin contact, listening to their mother's heartbeat, feeling her movements, becoming intimately familiar with the rhythm of human life. And here's where it gets really interesting. Your mother wasn't your only caregiver, not even close. In a band of 20 to 30 people, you'd have constant interaction with maybe 15 to 20 adults. Aunts, uncles, grandparents if they survived that long, cousins, unrelated band members who had their own reasons to ensure the next generation survived. This multiple caregiver system, what anthropologists call alloparenting, created something remarkable. You didn't bond exclusively with your mother, you bonded with the whole band. That woman processing plant fibers while your mother gathers roots. She sung to you, held you when you cried, let you nurse from her if she was lactating and your mother was occupied. That man crafting spear points while keeping watch on the children. He's carried you when the band moved, played with you, showed you how stones fracture and chips fly. This wasn't a modern nuclear family. This was communal child-rearing by necessity, and it created children who trusted multiple adults, who learned from diverse sources, who understood from their earliest moments that survival was a group project. Your early sensory education began immediately. Not formal lessons, just constant exposure to the sounds and sights and smells of human survival. From your position in the sling against your mother's body, you heard everything. The sharp crack of stone tools being made, the rhythmic scraping of hides being processed, the low conversations of adults discussing where to hunt, what plants were ready to gather, whether the weather was changing. You heard animal calls, lots of them. Birds that signaled dawn or warned of predators, the bellowing of large mammals that might represent food or danger, the rustling of smaller creatures in the undergrowth. Your developing brain was cataloguing all of it, building a mental library of sounds that meant safety, sounds that meant danger, sounds that meant food, sounds that meant run. You learned weather before you learned words, the smell of rain coming, the quality of light before a storm, the way wind sounded different when it carried moisture or dust, the subtle temperature changes that signaled seasonal shifts. This wasn't abstract knowledge, this was survival information absorbed unconsciously through constant exposure. You learned the rhythms of human work, the band waking at dawn, the bustle of breaking camp or preparing for a hunt, the quiet concentration of tool-making in the afternoon, the social sounds of evening, people eating together, sharing information, telling stories around the fire, all of it washing over you, patterning your brain to the cadences of human cooperation at survival. Then, somewhere around age 1 or 2, you became mobile. And this is where Ice Age parenting diverged most dramatically from anything modern. Once you could crawl, then walk, you had remarkable freedom. There was no nursery to confine you to, no playpen, no baby gates. The camp was your territory, and within its boundaries you could explore. Want to investigate that pile of animal bones left over from last night's meal? Go ahead. Curious about the stone tools someone left by the fire? Touch them, see what they do. Interested in the gathered plant materials waiting to be processed? Pull them apart, see how they're constructed. This wasn't negligent parenting. It was calculated exposure to manageable risk. Adults were always watching, but they weren't hovering. They were letting you learn through direct experience with minor consequences teaching major lessons. You touched something sharp and it hurt a little. Now you understood sharp without needing a lengthy explanation. You got too close to the fire and felt uncomfortable heat. You learned the danger zone without suffering serious burns. You grabbed a stick that turned out to have thorns. Pain taught you to look carefully before touching. There was no concept of baby-proofing because the entire environment was inherently unsafe. Sharp tools everywhere, fire constantly burning, animal remains with bones that could cut or splinter, poison plants growing within walking distance of camp. Rather than trying to eliminate all dangers, which was impossible in a mobile hunting and gathering lifestyle, adults supervised and intervened only when risks became serious. This created children who learned about danger early and directly. By age 3, you'd have a sophisticated understanding of what could hurt you and how to avoid it. Not because someone lectured you about safety, but because you'd experienced minor versions of every major risk, and your brain had learned to recognize and avoid them. The supervision was constant but not intrusive. Adults working near camp would track children's locations and activities without necessarily interacting with them constantly. If a toddler started wandering toward the edge of camp, someone would call them back or go get them. If a child was doing something genuinely dangerous, adults would intervene immediately. But for everything else, for the 1,000 small explorations and experiments and minor mishaps of early childhood, adults let experience do the teaching. This created what anthropologists call a peer play culture. By age 3 or 4, you'd spend much of your day with other children in a mixed-age play group. Not organized activities or structured playtime, just kids ranging from toddlers to teenagers hanging out together within sight of camp, engaging in the universal childhood activities of exploring, playing, pretending, and learning from each other. Older children watched younger ones, not because adults assigned them babysitting duties, but because that's what happened naturally in a small band where everyone's survival depended on everyone else. A 7-year-old who'd been watching adults hunt for years would show a 4-year-old how to throw a stick at a target. A 10-year-old who'd been gathering with the women would teach a 5-year-old which plants were safe to touch. This mixed-age play did something crucial. It transmitted practical knowledge across age groups without adult instruction. The older children weren't formally teaching. They were just doing what they knew how to do, and younger children learned by watching and imitating. It was cultural transmission through play, and it was incredibly effective. But let's talk about what you were actually learning in those first 5 years. Not reading or writing, obviously. Not numbers or formal concepts. You were learning survival skills so fundamental, that modern humans have mostly forgotten they need to be learned at all. You were learning to recognize safe versus dangerous, which plants had thorns and which didn't, which animals would run away and which might charge, which insects would bite and which were harmless. This knowledge wasn't taught through verbal explanation. It was learned through observation and occasional painful experience, encoded in memory as instinctive recognition. You were learning the geography of your territory, not from maps, but from constant movement through the landscape. By age 4, you'd recognize dozens of landmarks, know the locations of seasonal water sources, understand the routes between frequently used campsites. Your mental map of the world was being built through direct physical experience, step by step across the terrain. You were learning social dynamics, who had status in the band and who didn't, who made decisions and who followed, which adults were patient with children and which had short tempers, which other children could be trusted and which might push you or take your things. You were learning the complex web of human relationships that determined everything about your life, absorbing social knowledge that couldn't be taught, only experienced. Most importantly, you were learning by doing. Want to understand how fire works? Watch adults tend it, help gather fuel, eventually add sticks yourself under supervision. Want to know how food is prepared? Watch adults process plants and butcher animals, help with simple tasks, gradually take on more complex roles. Want to learn about tools? Handle the finished products, watch them being made. Try making crude versions yourself, even though they don't work very well. This was education without schools, learning without formal instruction. It was childhood lived in the constant presence of survival activities, with lessons embedded in every daily task and every interaction with the environment. There were no teachers because every adult was a teacher. There were no students because every child was constantly learning just by living. By age 5, you'd have practical knowledge that would amaze modern parents. You could recognize hundreds of plant species, identify dozens of animal tracks, navigate complex terrain, understand weather patterns, and handle basic tools. You couldn't read, but you could read the landscape. You couldn't do math, but you could estimate distances, quantities, and time with remarkable accuracy. You'd also have suffered losses that would be unimaginable to modern children. Siblings who died in infancy, band members lost to disease or injury or predator attacks, times of hunger when food was scarce, times of fear when dangers threatened the camp. Your childhood was happening in a world where death was commonplace, and survival was never guaranteed. But you'd also have experienced something modern children rarely do. You'd be completely embedded in your community, confident in your value to the band, secure in your relationships with multiple caring adults, and equipped with practical knowledge that made you a contributing member of society from your earliest years. You weren't being prepared for life. You were living it, right from the start. And everything you learned in those first 5 years was teaching you the most important lesson of all: how to survive in a world that didn't care whether you made it or not. So we've established that Ice Age kids didn't have schools, no classrooms, no textbooks, no standardized tests. But here's what they did have: the most sophisticated educational system in human history. Just one that looked nothing like what we'd recognize as education today. Because every day, from the moment a child could walk, they were learning. Not sitting in a room memorizing facts, but moving through a landscape that was simultaneously their home, their survival manual, and their final exam. The territory itself was the textbook, and that textbook was enormous. A typical Ice Age band would range across 200 to 300 square miles over the course of a year. maybe more in lean times, maybe less if resources were abundant. But whatever the size of their range, every child needed to know it intimately. Not just know it, internalize it. Build a mental map so detailed and accurate that they could navigate in darkness, in storms, under conditions where a single wrong turn could mean death. This wasn't optional. It wasn't extra credit. It was the foundation of everything else they would learn. Modern hunter-gatherer groups, which give us our best window into Ice Age. Childhood, show us how this worked. Children as young as 3 or 4 begin accompanying adults on daily rounds, initially just toddling along, playing, not paying obvious attention. But they're absorbing everything. The path through the thorn bush that doesn't tear your skin. The rock formation that looks like every other rock formation except it marks the way to the spring. The tree that stands alone on the ridgeline, visible for miles, the landmark that tells you you're heading toward the winter camp. By age 7 or 8, most children could navigate several miles alone and find their way back. By 10, they knew every water source within a day's walk, every cave, every overhang, every place you could shelter from a sudden storm. They knew the dangerous spots, the cliff edges that crumbled, the marshes that looked solid but could swallow you. They knew the good spots, the berry patches that fruited early, the meadows where deer grazed at dawn. This knowledge wasn't taught in formal lessons. It was narrated constantly during every walk, every gathering expedition, every hunting trip. Adults talking, always talking. See that hillside, the one with the white rock showing through? That's where the flint is. Good flaking quality, better than the grey stone from the river gorge. We'll come back here when we need new blades. Or, smell that? That's cat. Big one, probably male. He marked this territory yesterday, maybe the day before. We don't camp here. We don't even linger. This is his range, not ours. The landscape wasn't just memorized. It was read like a constantly updating story. The bent grass that showed where animals had bedded down. The scratch marks on tree bark that told you a bear was claiming territory. The disturbed earth near a waterhole that meant a predator had made a kill recently, which meant there might be scraps to scavenge but also meant danger. This kind of detailed environmental knowledge required thousands of hours of direct observation. But Ice Age kids had those hours. They spent essentially all their waking time outdoors, moving through their territory, watching, listening, absorbing. And the territory was just the beginning. The real curriculum was far more complex. Take plants. In a typical Ice Age environment, there might be 300 to 500 different plant species. Of those, maybe 150 were directly useful to humans. 50 or 60 might be edible. Another 50 provided materials for tools, cordage, medicine, or fire starting. 20 or 30 were actively dangerous, poisonous enough to sicken or kill. Every child needed to know all of them, not just identify them by sight, but understand them across their entire life cycle. Because plants don't look the same in spring as they do in autumn. The nutritious root you can dig up in early spring becomes fibrous and bitter by midsummer. The leaves that will kill you in June are safe to eat in April before they mature. The berry. That's toxic when green becomes nutritious when it turns dark red, but only if it's the right kind of red. The similar-looking berry that turns a slightly different shade of red will make you violently ill. This botanical education started as soon as children could walk. Mothers and grandmothers would narrate plant knowledge constantly during gathering expeditions. These leaves, the ones with the fuzzy backs, we can eat these, but not those, see the smooth ones. Those make you sick, feel the difference. Or, this root. This is for when your stomach hurts. You chew it, just a little bit, not too much. Too much makes things worse. By age 5, most children could identify the most common edible and poisonous plants. By 8, they were competent gatherers, able to contribute meaningfully to the family's food supply. By 12, they knew more practical botany than most modern biology students. They understood plant seasonality, habitat preferences, what plants indicated good soil or reliable water. They knew which plants attracted useful animals and which ones kept predators away. But they didn't learn this from lectures or memorization. They learned it by doing. Walking beside adults who gathered every single day, watching their hands select certain plants and pass over others, listening to the constant narrative, and eventually gathering themselves under watchful eyes that would correct mistakes before they became dangerous. The same process applied to animal knowledge, and the curriculum was even more complex. Ice Age children needed to understand dozens of animal species, not just recognize them, but understand their behavior, their patterns, their psychology. Because human survival depended on predicting what animals would do, where they'd be during different seasons, how they'd react to different weather conditions, whether they were dangerous or approachable, whether they were worth hunting or better left alone. Migration patterns were memorized across years of observation. The caribou herds that moved north in spring and south in fall, following routes that changed slightly each year depending on rainfall and plant growth. The salmon runs that brought fish upstream at specific times, dates that varied by river and by year, but followed patterns that could be learned. The birds that arrived in spring carrying the promise of warmer weather, and the birds whose appearance meant winter was coming, time to move to protected valleys. Tracking skills were essential. A child might start learning to read tracks at age 4 or 5, beginning with obvious signs. See this print? That's deer. 4 toes, split in the middle. See? Now these are different. 3 toes, bigger, those are from the giant ground sloth. We don't hunt those. They're too dangerous for what you get. By age 8, children could follow a trail well enough to stay with adults during a hunt. By 12, they could track independently, reading disturbed soil, bent grass, claw marks on trees, the subtle signs that told stories of what animals had passed by hours or days before. But tracking wasn't just about following animals you wanted to hunt. It was equally about avoiding animals that wanted to hunt you. Ice Age Europe was full of large predators, cave lions bigger than modern lions, cave bears that could weigh 1,500 pounds, saber-toothed cats, hyenas the size of modern bears, and all of them saw humans as potential prey. So children learned predator behavior with deadly seriousness, how to recognize fresh tracks versus old ones, the difference between a predator traveling through versus a predator actively hunting, the warning signs that you'd wandered into a den site or a kill zone, the behaviors of prey animals that indicated predators nearby, the sudden alertness, the frozen posture, the explosive flight that meant danger was close, even if you couldn't see it yet. They learned which animals were dangerous when and which could be approached. A bear in late summer, fat from feeding, might amble away from humans. That same bear in early spring, lean and hungry after hibernation, was deadly. A mammoth cow without a calf was generally indifferent to humans. A mammoth cow with a calf would charge anything that came too close. A wolf pack that had just made a kill might let humans approach to scavenge scraps. A wolf pack that was actively hunting would view humans as competitors, maybe as targets. This knowledge wasn't theoretical. It was visceral, learned through direct observation, reinforced by stories of people who'd gotten it wrong and died. Weather literacy was equally critical, because weather in Ice Age Europe wasn't just inconvenient, it was lethal. Storms could drop temperatures by 40 degrees in hours. Snow could trap groups away from shelter. Floods could cut off river crossings. Drought could eliminate water sources. So children learned to read weather in everything around them. Cloud formations that indicated storms building. Wind shifts that preceded temperature changes. Animal behaviors that predicted weather shifts. Birds flying low before rain. Insects swarming before clear skies. Bears denning early before harsh winters. The colour of the sky at dawn that told you whether the day would be safe for travel. The smell of the air that indicated rain coming, snow coming. The pressure shifts that modern people don't even notice, but the Ice Age children read like headlines. They learned seasonal patterns across years of observation, when the first hard frost typically arrived, when snow usually melted enough to open high-altitude passes, when spring rains made certain river crossings impossible. This knowledge was transmitted through storytelling as much as direct observation. Elders recounting weather patterns from decades past, teaching children the long rhythms that governed survival. Water knowledge was its own specialized curriculum, because water sources weren't just about quenching thirst. They were about survival strategy, animal behavior, seasonal planning, and danger assessment all rolled into one. Children learned to locate water from miles away. By reading vegetation patterns, the way certain plants clustered in lines that marked underground streams. By watching animal trails, understanding that multiple species paths converging meant water was near. By observing bird flight patterns, the way certain species flew directly to water at dawn and dusk. By listening for sounds that carried for miles, the rush of streams, the croak of frogs that marked permanent wetlands. But finding water wasn't enough. You had to understand it. Children learned that water that looked crystal clear might be deadly, mineral springs that poisoned anyone who drank. They learned that stagnant water needed to be avoided, that moving water was generally safer, that water from high elevation springs was better than water from lowland pools. They learned seasonal water patterns, which streams ran year-round and which dried up in summer, which water holes were reliable in drought and which disappeared. They learned to assess water quality by observation, the presence of certain aquatic plants that indicated safe water, the behavior of animals, understanding that if large animals drank regularly from a source, it was probably safe. The smell and taste tests that could detect contamination before it made you sick. This knowledge network was reinforced by the fact that water sources were social hubs. Multiple bands would meet at reliable water sources, sharing information, updating their knowledge. Children at these gatherings would learn not just about water, but about the larger geography of human movement patterns across hundreds of miles. Then there was geological knowledge, which sounds academic but was intensely practical. Stone tools were essential for almost everything Ice Age people did. Cutting meat, scraping hides, working wood, making other tools. But you couldn't make good stone tools from just any rock. You needed specific types of stone with particular properties. Flint, obsidian, chert, certain types of quartzite. Rocks that would fracture predictably, creating sharp edges. So children learned geology. They learned to recognize toolstone in raw form, which often looked completely different from finished tools. They learned where to find it, the specific cliff faces, riverbeds, or hillsides that contained good material. They learned that different sources produced different qualities, that the black flint from one region was better for delicate work, while the grey stone from another region was more durable for heavy use. They learned which stones were good for other purposes. Smooth river stones that could be heated and dropped into water for cooking. Dense, tough stones that could serve as hammers for flint knapping. Soft stones that could be ground into pigments for decoration or hide preparation. Cave knowledge was critical for survival, not just which caves existed, but which were safe. Children learned to assess cave entrances for signs of predator use. The old kill remains that indicated a cave was a predator den. The scratch marks and scat that showed current occupation. They learned about carbon dioxide hazards, the way certain caves had dead air that could suffocate you if you went too deep. They learned about structural dangers, the caves with unstable ceilings, the passages that flooded during storms, the chambers where ice made walking treacherous. But they also learned which caves were safe shelters, which could be defended if necessary, which held stable temperatures year-round, making them valuable for food storage or refuge from extreme weather. All of this knowledge was integrated into understanding seasonal cycles, because nothing in Ice Age Europe was constant. Everything changed constantly, following rhythms that operated on timescales from daily to annual to multi-year. Children learned the annual calendar not from any written system, but from direct observation of natural cycles. They learned that certain plants flowering meant certain animals would migrate soon, that specific bird arrivals marked optimal times for gathering particular foods, that temperature patterns predicted resource availability months in advance. This seasonal knowledge was phenomenally complex. A child might learn that the best time to gather hazelnuts was exactly 2 weeks after the oak leaves reached full size, but only in years when spring rains were moderate. Too early and the nuts weren't ripe. Too late and squirrels had taken them all. But the timing shifted based on altitude, latitude, and yearly weather variations. They learned that fish ran upstream at different times in different rivers, but the timing in one river could predict timing in others if you understood the relationships. They learned that large herbivores moved to high altitudes in summer, but the exact timing depended on snowmelt patterns, which varied by year. They learned that berry patches produced heavily in some years and barely at all in others, following patterns related to previous year's rainfall and temperature. This wasn't just information. It was the operating system for human survival. Every bit of knowledge connected to every other bit, creating a mental model of the environment so sophisticated that modern ecologists with PhDs would struggle to match it. And the teaching method for all this complexity, walking and talking. That's it. Adults took children everywhere, narrated constantly, and let direct experience burn lessons into memory far more effectively than any formal instruction could. There were no tests, but failure had immediate consequences. The child who couldn't identify poisonous plants got sick. The child who didn't recognize predator signs got scared by a close call. The child who couldn't read weather got caught in a storm. These experiences usually managed to avoid actual disaster by watchful adults, created learning that lasted forever. By age 12, Ice Age children possessed environmental knowledge that would take modern people decades to acquire. They could navigate trackless wilderness. They could predict resource availability months in advance. They could read weather, animal behavior, and landscape features with accuracy that bordered on supernatural. They knew more practical ecology than most trained biologists. But they didn't learn it from books or lectures. They learned it by living in the landscape every single day of their lives, with teachers who never stopped narrating, and a final exam that was administered continuously by the simple fact of survival. The landscape was their classroom, and they graduated with honours, or they didn't graduate at all. Here's what nobody tells you about Ice Age education. There were no teachers, no curriculum, no standardized tests or grade levels or parent-teacher conferences. But Ice Age children learned more complex skills by age 12 than most modern adults will master in a lifetime. Because here's the thing. When your survival depends on whether you can start a fire in wet conditions, identify edible plants from poisonous ones, or track an injured animal for 3 days across varied terrain, learning isn't optional. It's life or death. And evolution doesn't mess around with life or death skills. So how did they do it? How did children growing up 50,000 years ago, without schools or books or YouTube tutorials, become competent at technologies that modern survival experts spend decades trying to master? The answer's actually simple. They started early, practiced constantly, and learned by doing real work with real consequences in the real world. Let's start with the most fundamental skill, tool making, specifically stone knapping, the art of turning rocks into knives, scrapers, spear points, and countless other implements that made human survival possible. Modern archaeologists who've tried to replicate Ice Age stone tools will tell you it's brutally difficult. You're basically hitting one rock with another rock and hoping to create sharp, useful edges without shattering everything into useless fragments. It requires understanding rock mechanics, three-dimensional spatial reasoning, precise hand-eye coordination, and thousands of hours of practice. Ice Age children started learning around age 4 or 5, not by making actual tools. They weren't stupid. You don't hand a 4-year-old a heavy hammerstone and expensive flint and tell them to go wild. They started with the leftovers. Archaeological sites from this period show distinctive patterns. Near the main knapping areas where adults worked, you find scatters of lower quality stone, practice pieces, and tool attempts that clearly came from less skilled hands. These are the training grounds where children learned by copying adults. The progression was systematic. First, just watching. Sitting near their parents or older siblings while they worked, observing the angles, the striking techniques, the way experienced knappers would examine a stone core from multiple angles before deciding where to strike. This might sound passive, but children's brains were recording everything. The sound a good strike makes versus a bad one. The way a skilled napper rotates the core after each strike. The body positioning that generates the right amount of force. Then came simple percussion. Children would get their own hammerstones and practice cores. Cheap, easily replaced rocks that nobody cared about. They'd spend hours just hitting rocks together, developing the muscle memory and coordination required for controlled strikes. Most of their attempts produced garbage, sharp fragments flying everywhere, cores shattering into useless pieces, maybe a few accidental edges that happened to be somewhat useful. Nobody corrected them much. There were no formal lessons, no step-by-step instructions. Adults might occasionally demonstrate a technique or reposition a child's grip, but mostly kids learned through trial and error, through making hundreds of mistakes and slowly, gradually figuring out what worked. By age 7 or 8, children who showed aptitude would start producing actual usable tools, simple scrapers, basic cutting flakes, rough chopping implements. Nothing fancy, but functional. They'd use these tools themselves for basic tasks, scraping hides, cutting plant materials, processing small game. This created an immediate feedback loop. Make a bad tool, struggle with your work. Make a better tool, your job gets easier. The progression continued for years. By age 10, skilled children could produce standardized tool forms, items that would be hard to distinguish from adult work in the archaeological record. By their teenage years, the best stoneworkers were producing sophisticated implements. Carefully retouched spear points with razor-sharp edges, specialized scrapers for different materials, backed blades that could be fitted into composite tools. The entire apprenticeship took 10 to 15 years to produce a master stoneworker. That's longer than most modern college degrees. But unlike modern education, every step had immediate practical value. You weren't learning for some future job. You were learning to make the tools you needed today, and the more skilled you became, the better your tools and the easier your survival. Fire mastery followed a similar pattern, but with higher stakes. Fire wasn't just useful, it was absolutely critical. It provided warmth in freezing conditions, protection from predators, a way to cook food and make it more digestible, light for working after dark, and the ability to harden wooden spear points and process certain materials. Lose your fire in winter and your group might die. So children learned fire skills early and thoroughly. By age 7 or 8, most Ice Age children could independently create fire in good conditions and maintain it indefinitely. This wasn't because they were somehow more talented than modern kids. It's because they practiced constantly, and the consequences of failure were immediately obvious. The learning started with fuel selection. Children as young as 4 or 5 would help gather firewood, learning to distinguish between wood types. Pine that burns hot but fast, hardwoods that provide long-lasting coals, the importance of dead-standing wood versus rotting groundwood, how bark and different plant materials could serve as tinder. They learned through direct experience which materials worked and which didn't, filing away a mental database of fuel properties that would serve them for life. Then came tinder preparation. Creating fire requires starting with something that will catch from a single spark or glowing ember. Dry grass, shredded bark, certain fungal materials plant down, each with its own properties. Children learn to prepare tinder bundles, carefully shredding and fluffing materials to maximize surface area, keeping them dry even in wet conditions. Understanding how different tinders behaved in different weather. Fire starting itself came next. The methods varied by region and materials available. Some groups used friction methods, bow drills or hand drills that created glowing embers through repeated rotation. Others used percussion techniques, striking iron pyrite against flint to create sparks. Both methods required practice and skill. Children would start with easier conditions, dry weather, good materials, plenty of assistance from adults. They'd practice creating sparks or embers, learn the exact motions required, develop the endurance to maintain friction long enough to generate heat. Many attempts ended in failure. Cold hands, poorly prepared materials, incorrect technique, just bad luck. But gradually, success rates improved. By age 8 or 9, competent children could create fire independently in favorable conditions. By their early teens, skilled firemakers could do it in rain, snow, or wind, could coax flames from damp materials when necessary, could read weather and plan ahead to keep fire materials dry, could maintain fires through the night using careful fuel management and banking techniques. This wasn't just a skill, it was a form of insurance. Every person in a band who could make fire increased the group's chances of survival. If the main fire went out, if groups split up temporarily, if someone got separated, anyone who could create fire had a much better chance of staying alive until rescue or reunion. Hunting education was perhaps the most complex learning process because it involved not just technical skills but strategy, patience, teamwork, and the ability to read animals and environments. The progression from observer to accomplished hunter took years and followed predictable stages. Young children from about age 4 to 7 were observers. They'd watch from safe distances as adults tracked and killed game, learning animal behavior, understanding how hunters communicated silently, seeing which techniques worked and which failed. This wasn't boring for them. Hunting was exciting, dramatic, often dangerous. Children absorbed lessons about which animals were safe to approach and which were deadly, how different species reacted to human presence, where animals liked to shelter and feed. Around age 7 or 8, children graduated to participants in drives and surrounds. These were hunting techniques where many people worked together to push animals toward kill zones or encircle them. Children's roles were simple but crucial, making noise to scare animals in particular directions, blocking escape routes, helping to finish off wounded game. The work was real and dangerous enough to be exciting, but supervised enough to be relatively safe. Small game hunting came next. Children would practice with throwing sticks, simple spears, rocks, targeting birds, rabbits, rodents, anything small enough that missing didn't mean starvation for the group. This developed hand-eye coordination, taught patience and stalking skills, and provided real food value. A child who could regularly bring home rabbits or ground birds was contributing meaningfully to the group's nutrition. By age 10 or 11, promising hunters began training with the real weapons for large game: spears, atlatls, whatever the local technology was. They'd practice throwing accuracy for hours, learn to care for and maintain their weapons, understand the biomechanics of different throwing or thrusting techniques. They'd study animal anatomy, learning where to strike for quick kills, how different species were built, where vital organs sat. Their first large game hunts were carefully supervised. Experienced hunters would position younger participants in safer locations, give them specific responsibilities, step in if things went wrong. But the young hunters were doing real work, throwing real spears at real animals with real consequences if they messed up. By their mid-teens, skilled hunters were full participants in the most dangerous and sophisticated hunts. They understood complex strategies like driving animals toward cliffs, coordinating multi-day tracking expeditions, reading weather and animal behavior to predict movements. They'd developed the physical endurance to pursue game for hours or days, the mental toughness to handle failures and close calls, the judgment to know when to push forward and when to retreat. The entire progression took 10 to 15 years. But unlike modern education, there were no gaps between learning and application. From the first observed hunt to the last, children were learning skills they'd use immediately and for the rest of their lives. Gathering provided different lessons but was equally sophisticated. Children actually had advantages here. Their small hands could reach into crevices and burrows that adults couldn't access. Their sharp young eyes spotted small items like berries and bird eggs more easily. Their lower perspective noticed ground-level resources that adults might overlook. So gathering education often started even earlier than hunting training. By age 4, children could recognize dozens of plant species and understand which parts were edible and which were poisonous. This knowledge was literally life-saving. Misidentify one plant and you could die in agony, get the whole group sick, or simply waste time and energy on useless resources. Children learned through constant repetition and observation. Every gathering expedition was a lesson. Adults would point out plants, let children smell and touch different species, demonstrate which berries were safe to eat and which to avoid. The lessons were reinforced daily because gathering happened constantly, not as special events but as part of regular movement through the landscape. The sophistication of gathering knowledge was extraordinary. Children learned seasonal timing, understanding that certain plants were only edible at specific growth stages. They memorized hundreds of species and their properties, which roots could be eaten raw, which required cooking, which needed special processing to remove toxins. They understood ecological patterns, knowing that certain plants grew near water, others in disturbed soil, still others in deep forest shade. They learned extraction techniques, how to dig roots without damaging the parent plant so it would produce again next season, how to harvest bark without killing the tree, which insects were edible and nutritious, and how to find their nests or burrows, where bird nests were likely, and when eggs would be available. By age 7 or 8, children were expert gatherers in their home territories. They could feed themselves for days from wild resources if necessary. They understood more botany and ecology than most modern adults with college degrees. And they'd learned it all through direct experience, through touching and tasting and succeeding and occasionally making painful mistakes. Hide processing and clothing creation was equally essential. In Ice Age climates, proper clothing meant survival. Poor clothing meant death from exposure. So children learned early and thoroughly. The work started with scraping. When hunters brought in game, the hides had to be cleaned of fat and tissue before they could be used. This was tedious, difficult work that required hours of repetitive scraping with stone tools. Children as young as 5 would help with easier portions, developing the arm strength and technique required, learning to recognize when a hide was properly cleaned. Then came stretching and drying, processes that prevented hides from becoming stiff and unusable. Children learned to recognize good drying conditions, how to stretch hides evenly when materials were ready for the next stage of processing. Brain tanning was perhaps the most sophisticated hide processing technique. Animal brains contain natural chemicals that soften leather and make it supple. The process required mixing brain tissue with water, working the mixture into the hide through repeated kneading and manipulation, then smoking the leather to make it water-resistant. Children learned these techniques through years of observation and participation, gradually taking on more complex roles. Sewing was its own skill set. Using bone or ivory needles and sinew or plant fibre thread, skilled sewers could create fitted, efficient clothing. Children learned to make simple cordage first, twisting fibres into usable thread. Then basic stitching techniques, practicing on scrap materials. By their early teens, competent sewers could create and repair their own clothing, a life-saving skill in harsh climates. Cordage and weaving skills extended far beyond clothing. Rope was one of the most versatile technologies available. You needed it for hafting spear points to shafts, creating snares and nets, building shelters, making bags and containers, rappelling down cliffs, even creating simple bridges across streams. A person who could make strong, reliable cordage from available materials was extraordinarily valuable. Children learned cordage making early because the basic technique, twisting fibres together so they locked into place, could be practiced endlessly with minimal materials. By age 6 or 7, most children could make simple 2-ply cordage from plant fibres, animal sinew, or even human hair in desperate circumstances. With age came sophistication. Stronger multi-ply ropes, specialized cordage for different applications, understanding which materials worked best in wet versus dry conditions. Tracking might have been the most cognitively demanding skill children learned. Expert trackers could look at seemingly empty ground and reconstruct entire narratives. An animal passed here 3 hours ago. moving quickly, favouring its left rear leg from an old injury pregnant female heading toward water. This wasn't magic. It was learned pattern recognition applied at superhuman levels. Children started learning tracking almost from birth. Every time adults followed a game or searched for resources, children observed. They learned to recognize footprints, understanding how different species left different marks, how tracks changed in different soil types and weather conditions, how fresh tracks looked versus old ones. They learned to read scat, recognizing which animal left which droppings, what the animal had been eating, how long ago it passed. They studied browsing marks where animals had fed, broken vegetation, disturbed ground, the thousands of tiny clues that revealed animal movement and behavior. The learning was cumulative and never-ending. A skilled tracker might recognize thousands of distinct patterns, maintain mental maps of where different animals typically moved, predict behavior based on season and weather and food availability. Children who showed aptitude for tracking were treasured because a good tracker could mean the difference between eating and starving, between finding game quickly and wasting days on fruitless searches. But here's what made all of this education work. It never felt like education. Children weren't sitting in classrooms feeling bored or resentful. They were playing games that happened to teach essential skills. Young children played at hunting, stalking each other through camps, throwing sticks at targets, mimicking adult hunting behavior. They were having fun, but they were also developing the exact skills they'd need as real hunters. Hand-eye coordination, patience, stalking technique, the ability to move silently. They played with fire, building tiny fires of their own, competing to see who could create the biggest flames or keep fires going longest. This was entertainment, but it was also fire management training. They made toy tools, practicing stone knapping with scrap materials, creating miniature versions of adult implements. This was their version of playing with dolls or action figures, except their toys taught them survival skills. They tracked each other during games of hide and seek, learning to read ground sign and predict movement. They played at gathering, competing to see who could find the most berries or dig up the biggest roots. The games were fun enough that children wanted to play them constantly. But the games were designed, consciously or unconsciously, to teach exactly the skills adults would eventually need children to master. By the time children transitioned to real work, they'd already spent thousands of hours practicing disguised as play. This was education at its most elegant. No coercion required. No bored students counting minutes until class ended. Children learned because learning was survival, because learning was embedded in daily life, and because learning was packaged as play and family time, and meaningful contribution to the group. By age 12 or 13, Ice Age children had completed an education that prepared them for literally anything their environment might throw at them. They could make sophisticated tools, create fire in terrible conditions, hunt dangerous game, process their kills, create clothing, build shelters, navigate unfamiliar territories, find food and water, and teach these skills to the next generation. They'd received no formal schooling, but they'd become competent in technologies and skills that would challenge modern survival experts with decades of training. Because when learning is survival, and survival is learning, education becomes something much more powerful than anything that happens in a classroom. It becomes life itself. But here's what might surprise you most about Ice Age childhood. The hardest lessons had nothing to do with hunting or gathering or tool-making. The real challenge, the skill that separated successful humans from dead ones, was learning to be part of a band. because your entire world was 25 to 50 people. That's it. Not just the people you saw every day, the only people you would see for months at a time. Your band wasn't just your family or your neighbours or your community. It was your entire society, your economy, your government, your entertainment, your security system, and your retirement plan all rolled into one tiny group of humans living together in impossible proximity. Think about that for a second. Modern kids might have 30 classmates they see for 6 hours a day, then go home to their own houses, their own rooms, their own space. Ice Age kids lived with the same 40 people 24/7, 365 days a year. You woke up surrounded by them. You ate with them. You worked with them. You slept within arm's reach of them. There was no privacy, no personal space, no option to just be alone for a while. And every single one of those people you had to get along with. Not like them necessarily, but get along with them. Because if you couldn't, if you created conflict or tension that threatened the band's cohesion, you were risking not just your own survival, but everyone's. The band wasn't held together by laws or governments or institutions. There were no police to enforce rules, no courts to settle disputes, no principals to send you to when you misbehaved. The band was held together purely by social bonds, networks of relationships so carefully maintained that they could support the weight of constant proximity without shattering. Children learned this the hard way. Watch a 3-year-old in the band throw a tantrum because they want more food. The adults don't punish them. They don't need to. The child sees the looks from the other band members. Disappointment, annoyance, concern. They feel the subtle withdrawal of attention and affection. They notice that later, when they want to join a game with older kids, nobody invites them. This is social learning at its most fundamental. You learn that your reputation matters because reputation is the only currency that exists. You learn that other people's opinions of you directly affect your access to food, protection, knowledge, and affection. You learn that being part of the group requires constant negotiation of your own needs against the collective good. By age 5 or 6, most Ice Age children had developed social awareness that would put modern adults to shame. They could read micro-expressions, detect tension between band members before it escalated, understand complex social dynamics involving people twice their age. They had to. Their survival depended on it. The core lesson, the absolute foundation of the social curriculum, was reciprocity. Not sharing, reciprocity. There's a difference. Sharing is giving something away. Reciprocity is understanding that giving something away today means someone will give something to you tomorrow. It's investment, delayed gratification, social insurance, all wrapped into one cultural practice. A hunter brings back a deer. He doesn't keep it for his family. He can't. There's no refrigeration. The meat will spoil in days, so he distributes it among the entire band, giving the best portions to the elderly, the nursing mothers, the sick. He's not being generous. He's being smart, because next week when someone else gets lucky, they'll remember his generosity. And the week after that, when his child is sick and he can't hunt, people will bring food to his family. Children watched this happen constantly. They saw their parents give away food they could have eaten themselves. They saw their family receive food when they had nothing. They experienced the network of reciprocity as a living, breathing safety net that caught people when they fell, and they practiced it themselves. A child finds a bird's nest with eggs. Their first instinct might be to eat them all immediately, but they've watched the adults. They've learned. They bring the eggs back to camp and share them, giving some to the elderly grandmother who tells the best stories, some to the teenage boy who's been teaching them to make better arrows. They're not being selfless. They're investing in relationships that will pay dividends for years. By adolescence, Ice Age children had an instinctive understanding of social economics that would take modern humans years of education to grasp. They knew who owed whom favors. They understood which relationships were strong and which needed reinforcement. They could navigate complex social situations involving multiple competing interests because they'd been watching and learning since they could walk. But reciprocity wasn't just about food. It was about everything: knowledge, labour, childcare, protection, sympathy, attention. Everything flowed through these networks of mutual obligation, and children learned to maintain multiple reciprocal relationships simultaneously, like jugglers keeping dozens of balls in the air at once. Now, all this intimacy and reciprocity sounds nice, but it created constant friction. Put 40 people together for months on end, and conflicts are inevitable. Someone takes more than their share. Someone doesn't pull their weight. Someone makes a decision that affects everyone without consulting the group. Someone's child hits someone else's child. Someone wants to move camp, but everyone else wants to stay. Modern societies handle this with hierarchies and institutions. We have bosses who make decisions, police who enforce rules, courts that settle disputes. Ice Age bands had none of that. They were fundamentally egalitarian, not because they believed in equality as a political philosophy, but because inequality was impossible to maintain. You can't have a permanent hierarchy when everyone has access to the same weapons, and anyone can just walk away and join another band. So children learned conflict resolution without authority, and this might have been the most sophisticated social skill they developed. Watch two Ice Age kids fight over a digging stick. They're 6 and 7 years old. In a modern school, they'd go to a teacher who would adjudicate. The teacher would decide who's right, impose a solution, maybe hand out punishment, but there's no teacher. The kids have to work it out themselves, and they can't just fight because the adults won't tolerate violence that threatens band cohesion. So they negotiate. The older child claims the stick because they made it. The younger child claims it because they found it first. They argue their cases to each other and to any adults who happen to be listening. The adults don't intervene directly, but they provide social feedback. A respected hunter might mention that he once let a younger child use his best spear, and the child took good care of it. An older woman might tell a story about 2 men who fought over a tool and both ended up worse off. The kids absorb these hints and eventually work out a compromise. Maybe they take turns. Maybe one child trades something else for the stick. Maybe they decide to make a second stick together. This happened constantly. Dozens of small conflicts every day, all resolved through negotiation, compromise, social pressure, and face-saving compromises. By the time these kids were teenagers, they had internalized this process so completely that they could navigate complex multi-party disputes without breaking social harmony. And they had to, because conflicts between adults could literally kill everyone. If 2 hunters had a serious dispute that escalated to violence, it could split the band. Half the people leave with one hunter, half stay with the other. Now you have 2 groups of 20 people instead of one group of 40, and neither group is large enough to hunt effectively or defend their territory. Everyone's survival drops. Children learned from watching adults that maintaining group cohesion was more important than being right. They learned to back down from arguments even when they knew they had the stronger case. They learned to accept compromises that didn't favor them. They learned that sometimes you had to swallow your pride and apologize even when you weren't entirely wrong. Because the alternative was destroying the social bonds that kept everyone alive. But the social curriculum wasn't all conflict and negotiation. Much of it was transmitted through the most powerful educational technology humans ever developed: stories. The band sat together every evening around the fire. After eating, after tool maintenance, after all the practical work was done, people talked. And the talk wasn't random. It was structured, purposeful, educational, though nobody would have used those words. Elders told stories about ancestors, not just who they were, but what they did. How great-grandfather survived a winter when game, vanished by eating roots and bark. How great-grandmother found a new water source by following birds. How a cousin got killed by a bear because he wasn't paying attention. How two bands avoided a war through a diplomatic marriage. These weren't entertainment. Though they were entertaining, they were case studies, scenarios that children might face someday, complete with analysis of what worked and what didn't. The stories encoded survival knowledge that couldn't be transmitted any other way. How to handle rare situations, what to do when normal rules didn't apply, how to think about risk and reward. But they did more than that. They created cultural continuity. Children learned they were part of something larger than themselves, a lineage stretching back generations. They learned their band's history, its relationships with other bands, its traditional territories and resources. They learned who they were. The stories also taught cosmology and meaning, why the world works the way it does, where humans came from, what happens when you die, how to relate to the spirits and forces that governed existence. This wasn't separate from practical education. It was the framework that made practical education meaningful. You didn't just learn to hunt, you learned why hunting mattered, what it meant to take an animal's life, how to show respect to the spirits who controlled game, and the stories were reinforced through music and rhythm. Every band had songs, chants, rhythms drummed on logs or clapped with hands. These weren't frivolous entertainment, they were mnemonic devices, information storage systems embedded in melody and rhythm, so they could be remembered precisely and transmitted across generations. A song about finding water encoded real information about landscape features, animal behavior, seasonal patterns. A chant about making fire contained the actual steps in sequence, set to rhythms you couldn't forget the order. A drumming pattern used in ceremonies marked important transitions and taught children about time, cycles, meaning. Children learned these songs from earliest childhood. By adolescence, they carried in their heads a library of encoded knowledge stretching back generations. And they learned that music wasn't just about information. It was social bonding, a way to create synchrony between band members. When you sang together, drummed together, danced together, you were practicing the coordination that would keep you alive during a hunt or a conflict with another band. The ceremonial life of the band was equally educational. Modern people tend to think of ritual as something separate from practical life, but for Ice Age children, there was no separation. Rituals marked transitions: birth, puberty, first kill, marriage, death. Each ritual taught something essential about identity and belonging and meaning. A child's first successful hunt might be marked with ceremony. The band gathered, songs were sung, the child was painted. With ochre or ash, elders spoke about what it meant to be a provider. This wasn't just celebration. It was formal recognition that the child's social status had changed. They were being incorporated into the adult world of responsibility and respect. And crucially, the child participated fully. There was no separate children's version of the ceremony, no age-appropriate modification. Children were present for everything: birth, death, coming-of-age rituals, healing ceremonies, negotiations with other bands. They saw life in all its dimensions from earliest childhood, learning not through abstract instruction, but through direct participation in their culture's meaningful practices. But the band wasn't the whole story. A few times a year, something extraordinary happened. Other bands would arrive at traditional gathering places. Suddenly your world of 40 people exploded to 200 or 300. For a child who had spent months seeing the same faces every day, this was overwhelming and thrilling and terrifying all at once. These gatherings served multiple purposes. Young adults looked for marriage partners from other bands. You couldn't marry within your own small group, the genetic risks were too high. So these meetings were essentially dating events where teenagers sized each other up and families negotiated alliances. But they were also trade fairs. Bands brought surplus goods, exotic materials from their territories, specialized tools or knowledge. You might trade ochre for obsidian, seal skins for acacia gum, information about game movements for knowledge about water sources. The networks of reciprocity that operated within bands extended across bands, creating regional and even continental exchange systems. And they were diplomatic conferences. Bands needed to maintain relationships, resolve disputes that had developed during the year, negotiate territorial boundaries and resource-sharing agreements. The fact that everyone was related through intermarriage helped, but conflict still arose. These gatherings were where they got handled, where elders from multiple bands worked out compromises that everyone could live with. For children, these gatherings were intensive education in dealing with strangers. Suddenly you had to navigate social situations involving people you didn't know, who had different customs, who might speak different dialects. You learned diplomacy, learned to read unfamiliar social cues, learned that your band's way of doing things wasn't the only way. You also learned your band's place in the larger world. You weren't just part of your immediate group. You were part of a network, a people, a culture that extended far beyond what you could see from camp. This created identity at multiple scales. You were yourself, part of your family, part of your band, part of your people. Each layer mattered. Each taught you something about who you were. And through all of this, running underneath every social interaction was a simple but profound lesson. Your survival depended on other people, not just on your own skills or strength or intelligence, but on your ability to maintain relationships, to be trusted, to be liked, to be someone others wanted to help when times got hard. The social curriculum wasn't separate from survival education, it was survival education. Because in the Ice Age, the most dangerous thing wasn't predators or starvation or climate. It was being alone. Around age 12 or 13, something dramatic happened to Ice Age children. Their bodies changed, their voices deepened or they began menstruating. They grew taller, stronger, their features sharpening toward adult proportions, and their entire world transformed overnight. Because here's the thing about puberty 50,000 years ago. It wasn't some awkward phase you suffered through while still protected by childhood. It was a threshold you crossed into survival responsibility. The band couldn't afford to support non-contributing members for years of extended adolescence. When your body said you were capable of adult work, the band expected you to do adult work. The transition was marked by rituals. Not the kind of sanitized coming-of-age ceremonies we might imagine today, but serious acknowledgements that you are now responsible for keeping people alive. For boys, the most common ritual involved their first major hunt. Not the practice hunts they'd been doing since age 7 or 8, tracking rabbits and practicing with small spears. This was the real thing. A multi-day expedition tracking large game. or ox or horses, or in some regions even mammoths, where mistakes could get you killed and success could feed the band for weeks. Imagine being 13 years old and hearing the senior hunters tell you it's time. You've watched these expeditions your whole life, listened to the stories, practiced the skills, but now they're handing you a full-weight spear, not a child's practice weapon, and expecting you to keep up as they track a prey animal for 3 days across rough terrain. You're carrying your own supplies, maintaining your own fire, making your own decisions about when to move and when to hide. The hunters aren't coddling you anymore. They're treating you like you know what you're doing, because the band's survival depends on everyone knowing what they're doing. The psychological pressure must have been enormous, but it was also necessary. These hunts required absolute coordination. Everyone needed to understand the signals, follow the plan, execute their role without hesitation. A teenager who couldn't handle the pressure wasn't just failing himself, he was risking the entire hunting party. So, the ritual served a dual purpose. It tested whether the boy had actually learned what childhood was supposed to teach him, and it transformed his identity within the band. Before the hunt, he was a child who helped out. After, he was a hunter whose contribution mattered, and the difference was profound. Successful participants in major hunts gained new status. They sat with the adults at evening fires. Their opinions were solicited in band discussions. They were expected to mentor younger children. Most importantly, they were now eligible for partnership, to begin the courtship processes that would lead to their own families. For girls, the transition was different but equally dramatic. First menstruation was marked by rituals that varied between cultures, but almost always involved acknowledgement from the band's adult women that the girl was now capable of bearing children and therefore needed to understand responsibilities that childhood hadn't fully prepared her for. But becoming a woman wasn't primarily about reproduction. It was about economic contribution. Teenage girls were often the most productive gatherers in the entire band. They had the knowledge that childhood had taught them, which plants were edible, where to find them, how to process them, combined with the strength and endurance that adult bodies provided. They could carry heavier loads than children, and travel farther than older women whose bodies were worn down by decades of hard labour and multiple pregnancies. More importantly, they became teachers and leaders. A 15-year-old girl might lead a gathering expedition of younger children and older women, making decisions about where to search for roots or nuts, how to respond to changing weather, when to return to camp. This wasn't playing at leadership. The band was trusting her with the safety of vulnerable members and expecting her to return with enough food to matter. Some teenage girls specialized even further. One might develop particular expertise in identifying medicinal plants, learning from an older healer which roots could reduce fever, which leaves could be chewed to ease pain, which fungi could treat infections. This knowledge was literally life-saving. Without modern medicine, the difference between surviving an injury and dying from it often came down to whether someone knew which plant to apply to the wound. Others became expert tool makers. Basket weaving might sound simple, but creating containers tight enough to hold water or strong enough to carry 50 pounds of nuts required enormous skill. A talented teenage basket weaver could produce goods that other bands would trade valuable resources to obtain, making her an economic asset whose contribution extended beyond her own band's immediate survival. The really remarkable thing was the courtship system that emerged during these teenage years. Because Ice Age bands were small and often related, you couldn't just partner with whoever you found attractive in your own group. That way led to inbreeding and genetic problems, so bands developed elaborate systems of interaction with neighbouring groups. regular gatherings where multiple bands would meet to trade, share information, and allow young people to meet potential partners. These weren't casual social events. They were crucial survival mechanisms. When a teenager partnered with someone from another band, they created kinship connections that could save lives. If your band faced starvation because gamer disappeared from your territory, you could travel to your partner's band and be taken in based on those kinship ties. If disease swept through your group, survivors could join relatives in neighboring bands rather than perishing alone. So, teenage courtship was taken seriously, not by restricting it or controlling it, but by expecting teenagers to make smart choices. You weren't just choosing someone you liked. You were choosing someone whose skills complemented yours, someone whose character suggested they'd be a reliable co-parent and band member, someone whose family connections would benefit your children. Parents and band elders had opinions, certainly. They'd warn against partnerships that seemed unwise, but they rarely forbade them outright. Because here's the thing, a 16-year-old who'd been contributing to band survival for 3 or 4 years wasn't a child anymore. They had proven judgment. They had survived situations that required quick thinking and good decision-making. If they chose a partner the elders thought was wrong, well, they'd have to live with the consequences, and the band had to trust they'd learned enough to make reasonable decisions. This created a courtship culture very different from what we'd recognize today. Teenagers met potential partners during interband gatherings. They evaluated each other based on demonstrated skills. Can she tan hide so soft it won't crack in winter? Can he track deer through conditions where others lose the trail? These were the questions that mattered. Attraction played a role. Human beings are human beings after all. But it was balanced against practical considerations that would determine whether the partnership could survive the brutal realities of Ice Age life. Some teenagers developed such specialized skills that they became valuable to multiple bands. A teenage boy who showed exceptional talent for tracking might be sought after by bands whose territories required more hunting expertise. A teenage girl with unusual healing knowledge might receive offers from groups that had recently lost their primary healer. These specialists could leverage their skills into advantageous partnerships, choosing not just a partner, but a band whose resources and territory aligned with their own strengths. And then there were the vision quests. Not every culture practiced them, but where they existed, they were significant coming-of-age ordeals. A teenager, usually around 14 or 15, would be sent alone into the wilderness for days or even weeks. No food, minimal supplies, just the skills they'd learned and their ability to survive independently. The stated purpose was spiritual, to receive guidance from ancestors or spirits, to discover your adult name or your life's purpose. But the practical function was obvious. It proved you could survive alone, that if you got separated from the band during a hunt or a migration, you wouldn't panic and die. You'd figure it out, find food, maintain fire, navigate back to familiar territory. The psychological impact of vision quests was enormous. Spending days alone in wilderness filled with predators, facing hunger and fear and isolation, forced teenagers to confront their own capabilities. Those who returned had proven something to themselves that no amount of practice hunts or supervised gathering could demonstrate. They could handle the worst-case scenario. They could survive when everything went wrong and no help was coming. Not everyone succeeded. Some teenagers failed vision quests, returning early or being found by search parties when they got into trouble. These failures weren't punished exactly, but they had social consequences. A young man who couldn't complete his vision quest might struggle to find a partner. his failure marking him as someone who might not handle crisis well. A young woman who returned early from her solo trial might find herself assigned to less prestigious work roles, gathering closer to camp rather than leading expeditions. But most succeeded. They returned lean and exhausted, often bearing self-inflicted scars or burns from rituals they'd performed alone, carrying stories of spiritual experiences that elders would interpret and discuss around evening fires. And they returned changed. No longer teenagers pretending at adult competence, but young adults who had proven they could function without the band's support. By their mid-teens, most Ice Age children were also becoming parents themselves. This might seem shockingly young by modern standards, but several factors made it workable. First, they weren't parenting alone. The whole band helped raise children. When a 16-year-old mother needed to join a gathering expedition, aunts and grandmothers cared for her infant. When a 17-year-old father went on a week-long hunt, uncles and older brothers ensured his partner and children had meat. Second, they were physically ready in ways modern teenagers often aren't. Years of constant physical activity had built strong bodies. Diets high in protein and fat, when food was available, provided the nutrition needed for pregnancy and nursing, and crucially, they'd spent their entire lives learning how to care for children. A 16-year-old Ice Age mother had already been helping raise babies for 8 or 9 years. She'd watched hundreds of births, assisted in childcare countless times, learned from experienced mothers what worked and what didn't. Third, early parenthood was expected and normalized. There was no stigma about being a young parent because everyone was a young parent. The band's survival depended on reproduction, and waiting until your late 20s or 30s to start having children, as many modern people do, would have seemed bizarrely irresponsible. You had children when your body was capable of having them, and the band helped you raise them while they helped you survive. This created family structures very different from modern nuclear families. Children had multiple caregivers from birth. They bonded with many adults, not just their biological parents. This redundancy was crucial. If a parent died, which happened frequently, the child wasn't orphaned in the sense we'd understand it. They simply continued being raised by the other adults who'd always been part of their care network. Young parents also maintained flexibility that older parents in some modern cultures have lost. A 17-year-old father could still learn new skills, adapt to new territories, change his specialization if circumstances required it. He wasn't locked into career paths or financial obligations that made change difficult. If his band decided to migrate to new territory, he could go without worrying about mortgages or job security or school districts. His job was to contribute to survival, and he could do that anywhere the band went. By age 16 to 18, most Ice Age teenagers had completed the transition to full adulthood. They participated equally in band decisions. They contributed economically at adult levels. They had partnerships and often children. They possessed specialized skills that made them valuable. They had proven through rituals and daily survival that they could handle adult responsibilities. There was no prolonged adolescence, no extended period of semi-dependency where you were too old to be treated as a child but not quite trusted as an adult. You either contributed or you didn't. You either possessed the skills survival required or you died. The transition from childhood to adulthood happened fast, compressed into just a few years of intensive learning and testing. But here's what made it work. All those years of childhood hadn't been wasted. The play that taught hunting skills, the gathering expeditions that built knowledge, the storytelling that transmitted survival information, the observation that developed judgment. By the time puberty arrived, Ice Age children actually were ready for adult responsibilities because childhood had been preparing them for exactly that since they could walk. We look back at 16-year-olds becoming parents and hunters and leaders and think it seems impossibly young. But we're judging from a world where 16-year-olds spend their days in classrooms, their survival needs handled by parents and social systems. Put that same 16-year-old in the Ice Age after a childhood of constant survival education, and they'd be ready. Not because they were more mature than modern teenagers, but because their entire lives had been systematically preparing them for exactly this transition. The real question isn't why Ice Age teenagers grew up so fast. It's why modern teenagers take so long. And the answer is simple. We can afford to. They couldn't. Now let's talk about what these Ice Age children didn't have. And I don't mean smartphones or video games. I mean something more fundamental. Something so built into our modern understanding of childhood that we can barely imagine growing up without it. Structure. Every single organizational framework we use today to define, manage, and control childhood simply didn't exist. And understanding what was missing tells us as much about Ice Age childhood as understanding what was there. First, there was no age segregation. None. Zero. Zilch. Think about modern childhood for a second. From the moment you enter the system, you're sorted by age. 3-year-olds in preschool, 6-year-olds in first grade, 13-year-olds in middle school. We spend our entire childhood surrounded almost exclusively by people born within 12 months of us. We learn from them, compete with them, measure ourselves against them. Age cohorts define our social world so completely that we think it's natural, inevitable, the only way childhood could possibly work. It's not. Ice Age children learned alongside everyone. The 6-year-old watched the 14-year-old making cordage, who was working next to the 30-year-old preparing hides, who was sitting near the grandmother processing plant fibers. When a child wanted to learn something, they observed whoever was doing it, regardless of age. A 4-year-old might spend the morning following a 10-year-old who was really good at finding bird nests, then the afternoon watching an adult napping stone tools, then the evening listening to an elder tell stories about animal behavior. This created something modern. Education has almost completely lost. Vertical learning. Knowledge flowing naturally from more experienced to less experienced individuals across all age ranges. The 10-year-old teaching the 4-year-old wasn't following a curriculum or fulfilling community service hours. They were just being watched by someone curious, maybe answering questions, possibly enjoying the status of being skilled enough that others wanted to learn from them. This absence of age segregation had profound effects. Children developed at their own pace without the constant comparison to same-age peers that defines modern childhood anxiety. A 7-year-old who was slower to develop hunting skills wasn't failing some standardized benchmark. They were just a person who hadn't gotten good at that particular thing yet, learning alongside others at various skill levels, taking whatever time they needed. Which brings us to the second missing structure. There was no standardized curriculum. Modern education operates on the assumption that all children should learn the same things at the same time in the same sequence. First graders learn addition, third graders learn multiplication, 8th graders learn algebra. The entire system is built on standardized expectations, standardized testing, standardized outcomes. We've industrialized childhood, turning learning into a factory process where we input children at 5 and expect to output educated adults at 18, all manufactured to roughly the same specifications. Ice Age childhood had none of this. Each child followed their own interests, developing skills based on what fascinated them, what they had talent for, what opportunities presented themselves. One child might become obsessed with tracking at 7, spending years developing extraordinary observation skills, learning to read landscapes like modern kids read books. Another might show no interest in tracking but become fascinated by plant processing, spending countless hours with adults learning which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which could be used for cordage or baskets or dyes. There was no moment when an adult said, "You're 8 now, so you need to learn these 17 specific skills." Learning was entirely self-directed, driven by curiosity and voluntary participation. Children learned what they wanted when they wanted, and the band accepted whatever pace each child naturally developed. This sounds chaotic by modern standards. How did they ensure children learned essential survival skills? What if a child just didn't feel like learning anything important? But here's the thing. When survival skills are embedded in daily life, when they're not abstract classroom subjects but immediate practical activities, children want to learn them. The 4-year-old watching cordage making isn't being forced to master fine motor skills in preparation for future writing. They're watching something genuinely interesting, something that produces useful objects right now, something that adults clearly value. The intrinsic motivation to participate in real adult work is powerful, especially when learning happens through observation and voluntary practice, rather than compulsory instruction. Third, and this is huge, there was no literacy or numeracy, not in any form we'd recognize. Modern childhood is dominated by abstract symbolic learning. We spend years teaching children to recognize letters, decode written words, manipulate numerical symbols. Reading, writing, and arithmetic form the core of modern education, the foundational skills upon which everything else supposedly builds. We start teaching these skills at 5 or 6 and spend the next 12 years developing them to increasing levels of complexity. Ice Age children never learned any of this. They couldn't read or write because written language didn't exist. They didn't do arithmetic because abstract mathematical notation hadn't been invented. Their minds never learned to process symbolic representations divorced from immediate physical reality. But, and this is critical, their brains weren't empty of cognitive complexity. They developed different kinds of intelligence, skills that modern education has almost entirely abandoned. Their spatial reasoning was extraordinary. They could navigate vast territories without maps, maintaining mental models of landscapes covering hundreds of square miles. They knew the location of water sources, good hunting areas, plant gathering sites, dangerous territories, all held in memory without any external notation. Their observational skills would seem superhuman by modern standards. They could read weather patterns from cloud formations, predict animal behavior from subtle environmental signs, identify individual animals from tracks days old. They developed what cognitive scientists call ecological intelligence, the ability to understand complex relationships between organisms and environments without any formal instruction in biology or systems thinking. Their memory was phenomenal. Without writing to externalize information storage, they memorized vast amounts of practical knowledge. Plant properties, animal behaviors, tool-making techniques, territory features, kinship relationships, story traditions. All of this was stored in individual brains and transmitted through observation and oral tradition. So, they weren't less intelligent than modern children. They were differently intelligent, their cognitive abilities shaped by entirely different selection pressures and learning environments. Fourth, there were no specialized childhood spaces. Modern childhood happens in carefully designed, age-segregated environments. Nurseries for infants, playgrounds for toddlers, schools for children, youth centres for teenagers. We've created entire architectures of childhood, physical spaces specifically designed for children, separated from adult work and adult spaces. These environments are filled with specialised equipment, toys designed by child development experts, educational materials calibrated to specific age ranges, safety features engineered to prevent any possible harm. Ice Age children had none of this. There were no playgrounds because play wasn't separated from the landscape of survival. There were no nurseries because infant care happened wherever adults were working. There were no schools because learning wasn't institutionalized into dedicated facilities. Children occupied the same spaces as adults, learning by being present in real work environments rather than sequestered in simulated learning spaces. When a 4-year-old wanted to play, they played with real objects. Sticks became spears, rocks became tools, clearings became hunting grounds. They weren't using toys designed to teach specific developmental skills. They were using whatever was available, often the same materials adults used, learning through direct experimentation with the physical world. When a 10-year-old wanted to practice skills, they practiced with real equipment in real contexts. They learned to make cordage by making actual cordage that could actually be used. They learned to knap stone by producing real cutting tools. There was no separation between practice and production, between learning activities and useful work. This absence of specialized childhood spaces meant children were always integrated into adult life. They weren't sent away to special places to develop. They developed right there, in the middle of everything, absorbing the rhythms of adult work through constant proximity. Fifth, there was no compulsory anything. Modern childhood is built on compulsion. Compulsory education laws, mandatory school attendance, require developmental milestones. We've legally mandated childhood, creating systems where children must attend school, must learn specific subjects, must achieve certain benchmarks, all enforced by institutional and legal authority. Parents can be prosecuted for not sending their children to school. Children can be held back if they don't meet grade-level expectations. The entire system operates through coercion, however gentle that coercion might be. Ice Age childhood had no compulsion because it had no institutions to enforce it. Children learned because they wanted to, because they were curious, because they were surrounded by competent adults doing interesting things. Nobody forced a 6-year-old to practice cordage making. They practiced if they found it interesting, if they wanted to be able to make useful things themselves, if they enjoyed the social interaction that came with learning alongside others. This voluntary participation created learning environments where motivation was always intrinsic. Children weren't studying subjects because adults said they had to. They were developing skills because those skills were immediately useful, socially valued, and personally satisfying. The modern problem of student motivation, of children who don't want to learn what schools are teaching, simply didn't exist when all learning was self-directed and practically oriented. Sixth, there was no institutional authority over childhood development. Modern childhood is managed by an entire professional class. Teachers, school administrators, educational psychologists, child development experts, pediatricians, all claiming specialized knowledge about how children should develop. These authorities define normal development, create standardized benchmarks, diagnose developmental delays, prescribe interventions. Parents are taught to defer to expert opinion, to trust that professionals know better than they do how children should be raised. Ice Age parents had none of this external authority. There were no experts because there was no specialized knowledge separated from practical experience. Every adult had been a child. Every adult had learned the skills they were now teaching. There was no professional class claiming superior understanding of childhood development. This meant parents and communities made their own judgments about how children were doing. If a child seemed to be developing slowly in some area, adults might offer more opportunities for learning, but there was no diagnosis, no intervention, no institutional concern. Children developed at their own pace, and the band accommodated whatever variation existed within their small population. Finally, there was no extended adolescence. Modern societies have created an entire life stage between childhood and adulthood, adolescence, a prolonged period of semi-dependence where young people have adult bodies but aren't expected to take on adult responsibilities. We've institutionalized this stage, creating high schools and colleges, establishing legal age boundaries, developing elaborate cultural rituals around teenage identity. Ice Age societies had puberty, but they didn't have adolescence. The transition from childhood to adulthood happened faster, more clearly, with less ambiguity about status. By their early teens, maybe even younger, children were taking on substantial productive responsibilities. They were contributing meaningfully to band survival, participating in adult work, being treated as junior adults rather than as oversized children. This wasn't exploitation, it was integration. Young people developed competence through real participation in adult activities, and as their competence grew, so did their status and autonomy. There was no artificial prolonging of dependence, no extended period of capability without responsibility. So when we talk about Ice Age childhood, we're not just talking about life before modern technology. We're talking about life before modern structures, before all the organizational frameworks we use to manage, control, and optimize childhood development. These children grew up in what modern experts would consider complete chaos, with no age-appropriate curriculum, no developmental benchmarks, no institutional oversight. And somehow they survived. They learned what they needed to learn. They became competent adults capable of extraordinary survival skills in harsh environments, which raises uncomfortable questions about whether all our modern structures are actually necessary, or whether we've built elaborate systems that serve institutional needs more than children's developmental ones. But we're not done yet, because there's one more aspect of Ice Age childhood we need to confront, the one that makes everything else look trivial by comparison: the mortality. But here's the thing about Ice Age childhood that nobody wants to talk about. Most of these kids didn't make it. We've been painting this picture of adventurous children learning survival skills, mastering tool making, becoming integrated members of their communities. And that's all true. But it's only part of the story. The other part is darker, harder to face, but absolutely essential to understanding what childhood was really like 50,000 years ago. Let's start with the numbers, because they're brutal. Modern estimates based on skeletal evidence, hunter-gatherer studies, and population modelling suggest that roughly 40 to 50% of Ice Age children died before their 5th birthday. Read that again. Half of all children born died before they could even begin serious training in survival skills, before they learned to hunt, before they mastered fire-making, before they became contributing members of their band. They were just gone. This wasn't unusual. This wasn't a crisis. This was normal. Every parent knew that bringing a child into the world meant facing better than even odds that they'd be burying that child within a few years. Every pregnancy was tinged with hope and dread in equal measure. Every infant who survived their first winter was a minor miracle, and the parents? They love their children just as intensely as modern parents do, but they also had to maintain some emotional distance, not because they were cold or uncaring, but because the alternative was unbearable. Imagine bonding completely with every infant, investing total emotional energy, only to lose half of them before they could walk properly. The psychological toll would be devastating. So Ice Age parents probably developed what anthropologists call pragmatic attachment. They cared for their infants intensely, but they also held back some emotional investment until the child demonstrated they were likely to survive. This might sound cruel by modern standards, but it was a survival mechanism. You can't function as a parent to your living children if you're completely emotionally destroyed by the ones who died. What killed them? Everything. Disease was probably the biggest killer, though it's hard to know for certain since soft tissue doesn't fossilize. But we can make educated guesses based on hunter-gatherer populations studied in the 19th and early 20th centuries, before modern medicine reached them. Respiratory infections were constant threats. A simple cold that a modern child would shake off in a few days could become pneumonia in an Ice Age child. No antibiotics, no decongestants, no way to clear fluid from lungs except coughing it up naturally. If a child's immune system couldn't handle it, they drowned in their own fluids. Gastrointestinal diseases were equally deadly. Parasites were everywhere in partially cooked meat, contaminated water sources and soil. Diarrhea that would be an inconvenience for a modern child could be a death sentence for an Ice Age infant. Dehydration set in fast, and without clean water or electrolyte solutions, there was nothing parents could do but watch their child weaken and die. Infections from injuries were catastrophic. A modern child gets a cut, you wash it, apply antibiotic ointment, maybe give them a tetanus shot. An Ice Age child gets a cut, their parents might wash it with water, maybe apply some plant medicines if they're lucky. But if bacteria got into the wound, if it became infected, there was no recourse. The infection spread through tissue, into bloodstream, and the child died of sepsis while their parents watched helplessly. But disease wasn't the only threat. These children lived in a world where they were literally prey. We've sanitized our understanding of prehistoric life, imagining humans as master hunters dominating their environment. But the reality, especially for children, was very different. Ice Age Europe and Asia were filled with massive predators. Cave lions that made modern lions look small. Cave hyenas that hunted in packs and could crack human bones with their jaws. Dire wolves that outweighed their modern descendants by 50 pounds. Cave bears that stood 11 feet tall on their hind legs and saw humans as competitors to be eliminated. For adults with weapons, coordination and fire, these predators were dangerous but manageable. For children, they was death on 4 legs. A child who wandered too far from camp, who went to collect water alone, who stayed out after dark chasing an interesting animal, might simply never come back. The band would search, finding nothing but tracks showing where a hyena pack had dragged the body away. Or they'd find scattered bones, evidence of a feeding site where something had consumed their child completely. The archaeological record preserves hints of these tragedies. Child skeletons with carnivore tooth marks, bones showing evidence of predator damage before fossilization. These weren't ritual practices. These were children who were killed and partially eaten before their remains could be recovered. How often did this happen? We'll never know for certain, but based on modern hunter-gatherer groups living in predator-rich environments, predation probably accounted for 5 to 10% of child deaths. That might not sound like much until you remember that we're already talking about 40 to 50% mortality. Every additional risk compounded the danger. And then there were the accidents. Ice Age children lived active outdoor lives in rugged terrain with no safety equipment, no emergency services, no trauma surgery. Falls were constant. A child climbing rocks to collect bird eggs loses their grip. A child crossing a stream slips on wet stones. A child playing on ice breaks through into freezing water. Modern children have similar accidents all the time, but they get taken to emergency rooms, get x-rays, get their broken bones set properly. Ice Age children had their injuries examined by adults who'd accumulated practical knowledge, but no formal medical training. Broken bones might be splintered incorrectly, leading to permanent disability. Internal injuries went undiagnosed. Head trauma that caused concussions or brain bleeding had no treatment at all. The child either recovered on their own or they didn't. Burns were horrific and common. Children lived around open fires constantly. A stumble into the flames, a spark landing on skin, hot cooking stones handled carelessly, these caused severe burns. Without modern burn treatments, these injuries often became infected. The child died days or weeks later in agony, their flesh rotting while they still lived. Then came starvation. We've talked about Ice Age life as if food was always available, as if skilled hunters could always bring down game. But that's not how it worked. The reality was feast and famine cycles that dominated existence. Sometimes game was abundant. Herds of reindeer or bison moving through territories, fish running upstream to spawn, seasonal nuts and berries ripening all at once. During these periods, everyone ate well. Even children got plenty of meat and fat, the calories they needed to grow. But sometimes the game disappeared. Herds migrated away early because of weather changes. Rivers froze before fish could spawn. Early frosts killed plants before they could produce seeds. When this happened, everyone went hungry, but children suffered most. Adults could push through hunger, drawing on fat reserves and sheer determination. Children couldn't. Their bodies were still growing, still developing. Malnutrition hit them harder and faster. A few weeks of serious food shortage was enough to cause permanent developmental damage. A few months could kill them outright. Parents faced impossible choices during these periods. Do you give your children the last scraps of food and go hungry yourself, weakening your ability to hunt and provide? Do you save some for yourself, maintaining your strength but watching your children suffer? Do you share equally and risk everyone becoming too weak to function? There were no good answers. Some children starved while parents desperately searched for any food source, turning to bark, roots, leather, anything that could provide calories. Other children survived but emerged stunted, their growth permanently affected by malnutrition during critical developmental periods. But perhaps the cruelest deaths came from violence. We like to imagine prehistoric humans living in harmony, small bands cooperating peacefully. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. Skeletal remains from this period show evidence of interpersonal violence, deliberately inflicted trauma, not hunting accidents. Weapons embedded in bones, defensive fractures on forearms where victims tried to ward off attacks, head injuries consistent with being struck from behind. Some of this was violence within groups, but much of it was between groups. Competition for resources, territorial disputes, revenge for previous attacks. These led to raids and ambushes, and children weren't protected. A raiding party attacking a rival band didn't carefully distinguish between combatants and children. They killed everyone they could catch, including infants. Sometimes children were taken as captives, absorbed into the attacking group to replace children who had died. But adoption wasn't guaranteed. A captive child might be kept or might be killed if the raiding group couldn't support additional mouths to feed. Children also became orphans through violence. A raid that killed both parents left children without protection or provision. The band might care for orphans or might not. Depending on resources, depending on relationships, depending on how many children the band already had to support. An orphaned child with no close relatives in the group faced grim prospects. They might survive on charity, taking whatever scraps were left after everyone else ate. Or they might be abandoned when the band moved to a new location, left behind because no one wanted to carry the burden of another mouth to feed. And then there were the children who were different, the ones born with disabilities, developmental challenges, physical limitations that made survival harder. Modern societies have built elaborate accommodation systems. We provide wheelchairs, hearing aids, special education, medical interventions. Ice Age bands had none of this. A child born with severe physical disabilities that prevented them from keeping up with a mobile band faced short odds of survival. Parents might try to carry them when young, but an older child who couldn't walk independently was nearly impossible to transport across rough terrain during frequent moves. A child born deaf missed crucial survival instruction based on verbal teaching. A child with developmental delays struggled to learn the complex skills necessary for hunting and gathering. Some made it anyway. Archaeological evidence shows individuals with serious injuries or disabilities who survived into adulthood, proving that Ice Age people sometimes cared for vulnerable members. But for every success story preserved in the archaeological record, how many failures left no trace? How many children with challenges were quietly abandoned? How many parents made the agonizing decision that they couldn't support a child who would never contribute to the group's survival? Weather was another constant threat. We've talked about Ice Age children as if they were always comfortably warm by fires, but the reality was much grimmer. These people had no permanent shelter. They lived in temporary camps, sometimes in caves if they were lucky, more often in structures made from branches, hides, and whatever materials they could gather. These shelters provided some protection, but nothing like modern insulated housing. During winter in Ice Age Europe, temperatures regularly dropped below zero. Children, with their smaller bodies and less efficient temperature regulation, were vulnerable to hypothermia. A child who got wet from snow or rain and couldn't get warm fast enough might develop hypothermia within hours. Their parents could build up the fire, wrap them in furs, hold them close for body warmth. But if the child was already too cold, if they'd passed the point where their body could generate heat effectively, there was nothing to be done. Heat exhaustion worked the other way during summer migrations across open landscapes. A child who couldn't keep up the pace, who needed frequent rest stops, might develop heat stroke under the relentless sun. No shade, limited water, and no way to cool them down except finding water sources that might be miles away. But here's what's remarkable. The ones who survived all this, they were extraordinary. Think about the selection pressure this created. Every child who made it to adulthood had survived disease, predators, accidents, starvation, violence, and weather extremes. They had demonstrated robust immune systems, quick reflexes, good judgment, physical toughness, and probably a fair amount of luck. These weren't average people. These were the children tough enough, smart enough, and resilient enough to beat odds that killed half their siblings. By age 15, an Ice Age human had survived challenges that would kill most modern adults. They had endured hardships we can barely imagine. They had watched friends and siblings die, had gone hungry, had been cold and scared and in pain, and had kept going anyway. This created a kind of human that doesn't exist anymore. People who had been tested constantly from birth, who had proven their capability through survival itself. When we look at Ice Age art, tools and settlements, we're seeing the work of these survivors, the absolute cream of human potential, the individuals who were so capable that even the brutal filter of prehistoric childhood couldn't eliminate them. That's who your ancestors were. That's the genetic legacy we carry. We're all descended from the children who refused to die, who survived everything the Ice Age could throw at them, who made it through childhood and became adults capable of thriving in the harshest conditions Earth has ever imposed on our species. But the price they paid, and the price their parents paid, was measured in small graves, scattered across 50,000 years of human history. So here's what we've learned about how Ice Age children actually grew up. They didn't go to school. They didn't have teachers, textbooks, or lesson plans. They didn't spend years learning abstract concepts they might need someday. Instead, they learned everything, absolutely everything they needed to survive, through total immersion in the real world from the moment they could walk. A 5-year-old watching her mother process an animal carcass wasn't taking a biology lesson. She was learning where food comes from. A 7-year-old tracking animals with his uncle wasn't doing an exercise. He was acquiring the skills that would keep him alive. A 12-year-old girl gathering medicinal plants with her grandmother wasn't memorizing information for a test. She was inheriting knowledge that could save her family's lives. This wasn't education in the way we understand it. This was learning as direct engagement with reality. Every skill had immediate consequences. Make a basket poorly, and your food falls through the gaps. Track an animal incorrectly, and your family goes hungry. Misidentify a plant, and someone might die. The feedback was instant, brutal, and absolutely effective. And here's the thing that should make us pause. It worked. For hundreds of thousands of years, this system produced competent adults. By age 15, Ice Age teenagers knew more practical survival skills than most modern adults will learn in their entire lives. They could make fire, build shelter, track and hunt animals, identify hundreds of plants, read weather patterns, navigate by stars, make tools from stone and bone, process hides into leather, and maintain the complex social relationships that kept their bands alive. They did all this without a single day of formal schooling. Because humans didn't evolve to learn in classrooms. We evolved to learn by watching, doing, failing, trying again, and gradually mastering skills in their actual context. Our brains are wired for apprenticeship, not instruction, for observation and imitation, not lectures and worksheets. Now, before anyone thinks I'm arguing we should abandon modern education and send our kids into the wilderness, let's be clear about what we've gained. Modern children learn to read and write, skills that open up entire worlds of knowledge that oral cultures couldn't access. They learn mathematics, science, history, things that would be impossible to acquire through pure observation. They learn in safety without the constant threat of starvation, predation, or environmental disaster that shadowed every Ice Age childhood. The trade-offs are real. We've gained literacy, specialization, and the accumulated knowledge of thousands of generations. We've gained childhood survival rates that would seem miraculous to our ancestors. But we've also lost something profound, that deep connection to the natural world. that confidence that comes from real competence, that understanding that learning isn't something that happens in special buildings at special times, but something woven into every moment of existence. Some modern movements are trying to recapture elements of that ancient learning system. Homeschooling families who let kids pursue intense interests through hands-on projects. Unschooling advocates who trust children's natural curiosity. Forest schools in Scandinavia where kids spend entire days outdoors in all weather. Montessori and Waldorf approaches that emphasize learning through doing. They're all in their own ways trying to work with human nature instead of against it, because maybe the real lesson from Ice Age childhood isn't that we should reject modern education. Maybe it's that we need to recognize what childhood was actually for 99% of human history. It wasn't protection from the world. It was preparation through engagement with the world. It wasn't a waiting period before real life began. It was real life, just at a smaller scale. Those Ice Age kids we've been talking about, they grew up. They became the adults who created the first art, who made music, who developed increasingly sophisticated tools and technologies. They were the ones who eventually spread out of Africa and colonized the entire planet. They walked across continents, crossed oceans, adapted to every environment from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests. And they did it all without schools, without textbooks, without educational experts telling them the proper way to learn. They just watched, practiced, failed, tried again, and gradually became capable of extraordinary things. We are their descendants. We carry the same brains, the same learning capabilities. The question is whether we're using them in ways that work with our nature or against it. If you found this look at Ice Age childhood eye-opening, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what surprised you most about how these ancient kids grew up. And subscribe, because we're going to keep exploring how human beings actually lived before civilization made everything complicated. Those Ice Age kids had no idea they were laying the foundation for everything that came after. They were just learning to survive. Turns out that was enough to change the world.